What did you come to with the study of the Great Reset as well as liberty? What do you now think where we currently are versus what do you think is the best? I think you did say this pretty explicitly in Upside Down Liberty, if I'm not mistaken, but for everyone else.
Yeah, the broader question here that I when I was zooming out, so I got really hooked into the 2020 stuff with the 2020 election and also everything with COVID because that divided the world. You basically had to have a political opinion. No opinion was an opinion at that point. It was so absurd. And then it was affecting people's health. Like, did you want to wear a mask or not? Did you want to get the jab or not? So like everyone was making decisions that put them in a certain bucket. And initially, I was very much just like resonating toward the people who were advocating for freedom, who were saying you should have a choice with this, and that the media is not telling us the full story with these injections. They're not telling us the full story with even COVID and so forth. So that was leading me very far away from the political left and the Democrats, who tended to be more pro-narrative. But then I was like, what's the correct politics with this stuff? Which then means basically, how should we be structuring society? That's what politics is about. And then I was trying to tie my work on consciousness into it because the Liberty book is the third one. And that led me to say, well, what is government itself? And who are the thinkers who are challenging the nature of government? And so the Liberty book gives the framework. I'll describe what I would say is maybe the ideal version. And in the book, I'm very clear to say, I don't know if we can get here, but this is at least conceptually ideal. And some people have read that book and they get upset with me. Mark, this is inconceivable. This would never happen. And I'm like, I say in the book, I don't know if this is conceivable, but we have to have a North Star. I don't know how clear I can be, but people selectively read and so forth. That happens. That just goes with the territory. Then the Reset book is basically applying some of the principles in liberty and then also looking at sociological trends to say, where are we being steered versus this ideal? And let's go through this. Excuse me. So what is government? I had never thought to ask that. Like I said before, I used to think that government was basically this benevolent entity that's here to help society. But then I started to look at it as a service provider, especially after reading the work of Larkin Rose, who wrote a great book called The Most Dangerous Superstition. And then also the work of Murray Rothbard, Ludwig von Mises, the Mises Institute, which is based in Auburn, Alabama. I've spoken there twice, actually, at the Austrian Economics Research Conference. They're doing amazing work. And on their website at Mises.org, they have a lot of free resources where you can read full books by these amazing people, like PDFs, and some of them are even audible. Okay, so government as a service provider. That's a different way of looking at it than how I used to look at it. Because I worked, like you said, I worked in the business world. I did investment banking in New York. I was working in Silicon Valley, advising tech companies. Service providers are all over the place. Any business is providing a good or a service to a customer. I was a service provider. I provide advisory services to businesses and inventors that needed support, for example. And what happens often when you have a service provider and a customer is there's a contract between the parties that is mutually agreed upon and signed, where the service provider says, look, these are the things I'm going to do for you. This is how you can terminate. This is the price. It's all laid out very explicitly, and the customer agrees to it. And if the customer makes a mistake and hires the wrong person, like at least they agreed to it beforehand, and maybe they fire that service provider and they hire someone else. They have an ability to do that. And then I was looking at government that way. Whoa, well, government is providing services for sure. It provides courts, road servicing, military, police, very important things for society. But these service providers have special privileges because we haven't explicitly consented to it in the same way that you would consent to a service provider where you have the contract out and you've mutually agreed upon it. Some would say that we have actually consented to government through like birth certificates and things like that. I don't know enough to comment. But the point is, you're not sitting down with the service provider and saying like, this is what I agree to. If we are agreeing, it's not like a informed consent process and mutually agreed upon. So I'm harping on this because you end up in a situation with implied consent. And that's where the rub happens. When you have implied consent, you have the ability for tyranny, basically, where one group of people can do things that you didn't agree to. And this even occurs, dare I say it, in democracy. Like we tout democracy as this amazing thing. There's a difference between compulsory democracy and a voluntary democracy. Compulsory democracy is what we have now, and we're seeing it starkly after the 2024 election. Half the country feels disenfranchised because now things are going to be imposed on them that they didn't want, whereas the other half says, great. Is that a great system? I mean, even if you agree with the current regime that we're going to have that's going to be better, is it morally acceptable to impose something on other people? Is a compulsory democracy good? I would say it's a form of tyranny. It's literally the majority imposing its will on the minority. And some people say that's better than a monarchy. I don't know what's better. Like Hans Hermann Hoppe wrote a book, I think it's called Democracy, the God That Failed or something, where he compares democracy to monarchy in some interesting analyses. But in any event, you're talking about tyranny. So what's the alternative to that? The alternative, and by the way, your audience is probably asking, well, what would we do with the roads? What would we do with the military? I go through that in the book. You get into exercises of theoretical economics, and basically a free market could handle these things. Is it going to be good? Maybe not. Is it good now? No. So you end up talking about the lesser of two evils, what's relatively less bad. But the point is that when you have demand in a marketplace, there's a financial incentive for suppliers to come in, no matter what that thing they're supplying is. And in a free market, the incentives are properly aligned. Whereas with government, excuse me, with government, you end up with like a Department of Education, for example, that's doing a bad job with education. And then they could say, yeah, the education's not great in this country. Give us more money. It's like a complete perverse incentive. Sometimes when you do worse, you can get more money in a free market. No, you go out of business if you do a bad job. Point being, there's a way to explain all this stuff. And you end up in what's known as voluntarism, where you get rid of all compulsory government and every service that government provides could be provided in a free market. You end up with no compulsory political monopoly, because that's what we currently have, a political monopoly. And the Great Reset is an example where society is being steered toward more government, more international collaboration between governments, and more centralization of power, which is, to me, a very dangerous thing.
I'm just a weird guy. I just can't turn it off. So when I started hearing, and you talked about it in the book, and I loved that you talked about it, similar to Upside Down Thinking, when I came across Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff, it was a similar kind of sensation that I felt when you brought up stakeholder capitalism, right? And the way they changed this one word because it still sounds good, right? And you're like, it's not really the same, because it's not an allegiance to shareholder capitalism, or the owners of the company and the customers of the company. Stakeholder capitalism is, well, wait a minute, you didn't build those roads, right? Or everybody has a stake in this thing. And you go, these aren't the same things anymore. And I love that you dove deep into those conversations.
Yeah, so this is in the Reset book. And so the Great Reset, if your audience isn't familiar with it, just to explain, because some people have heard the term and they're like, oh, this is some conspiracy theory. It's actually an explicit pronouncement by the World Economic Forum. It started off with Klaus Schwab, who was the executive chairman of the World Economic Forum, one of the most powerful organizations.
The book is available on Amazon, by the way. COVID-19, The Great Reset. Like, you can go get it. I had an old business partner that bought it and put it in his coffee shop. Literally, as a joke. Yeah.
COVID-19, The Great Reset. You can buy this book written by Klaus Schwab, but he announced it with then Prince Charles before the book was published. So these are powerful people saying, COVID's here, it's time for a great reset. And then people, if you talked about it back then, you were a conspiracy theorist, because the book is using very benevolent language. Like, this is all to make society better. COVID's challenging, yes, but we're going to make society a better place for all these reasons. So I said, look, let me break this down, because we're being steered in a very dangerous direction, and it's being positioned in flowery, benevolent language. And let's break it down into simple language. Like, what are they actually saying? So I broke it down into 6 categories of the ways in which they are steering society, or at least want to, even though in their books, because there are multiple books actually, they don't say it this way. And I break it down into culture, politics, economics, environment, i.e. climate and CO2 in particular, technology, and metaphysics. That those are the broad categories in which they want to steer society. And what you're talking about is the economics part, where, I mean, as a person who's anti-government and pro-voluntarism, where everything should be voluntary, and therefore pro-capitalism, voluntary exchanges in the marketplace, whereas under the current way we do capitalism, it's not true capitalism. You have governments intervening and getting to steer things, and they say it's still capitalism. It's actually not. I mean, one of my favorite quotes, and I quoted in Liberty and Medicine, I think, maybe Reset, I'm not sure. When buying and selling are controlled by legislation, the first things to be bought and sold are legislators. When buying and selling are controlled by legislation, the first things to be bought are legislators. So if you have the economy controlled in any way, Even if it's light control, you can buy those people and then steer the market in your favor. So you end up with a problem of cronyism, effectively. And then enter stakeholder capitalism. So first of all, you put anything in front of the word capitalism, to me, it's a misnomer, because capitalism means free and voluntary exchanges without any outside influences. This again gets to the Austrian School of Economics. Check out Mises.org, Mises.org. Then you introduce stakeholder capitalism. Like, what does that even mean? Who are the stakeholders? It's this very vague term which allows some people to steer the economy in the way that they feel is best, even though it sounds really nice, because all the stakeholders should have a say, is what Klaus Schwab is talking about. And that was one of the big themes in the book, whether it's stakeholder capitalism or something else, whether it's we should basically restrict our consumption to save the planet because there's too much CO2. It's always something that sounds really nice and appeals to the notion of compassion and feels good. But just because something feels good internally doesn't mean that it's going to be a policy that has positive changes in the world. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. And that's what this is about with regard to the Great Reset, but I think so many things in the world where we get, our psyche gets hijacked and we're told it's for the greater good, it's for the collective, and therefore you're a good person by following this. When in reality, there's a deception here. It can be a wolf in sheep's clothing.
What is your perspective then now on medicine? What's going on, guys? If you like that clip right there, you will love the full interview. You can check that out right there. I'll see you on the next video. Oh, and subscribe, because we got a lot of big things coming up in the near future.